Hope you guys are having a great start to your day. My name is Roel, and this is part of my Zero to Network Automation live stream where I go through learning Python, trying to figure out how I can get to knowing nothing, then moving to Python, and then automating the network. And so in today's video, I'm actually going to be looking at some Python basics. And these Python basics are really just a way to get started with Python. So I'm going to assume that you've already installed Python. You can go to python.org and download Python for your computer. And then for us, we're just going to get started. I'll share my screen and spend some time talking about data types. We're also going to talk about variables, some operators, and some basic built-in functions to get started with Python. So if you haven't seen my previous live stream, that was when I just discussed how I was going to take this journey into learning Python and how I would figure out how I would get to a certain path of automating the network along with different vendors' equipment. And right now, I'm doing a mix of like Juniper, Mist. We've got Cisco Meraki, Palo Alto firewalls, and then some other systems that do with monitoring. And so with this, we'll kind of dive in because so this is my iTerm window, and I will just do everything through the Python shell right now, just to talk about the basics of Python. And once you have Python installed, it's really just opening up terminal and typing in Python. So for here, we would just do Python 3, for example, and then there we are. So I'm on Python 3.13.7. If you don't know, the latest update to Python is 3.14. Of course, that is Py, kind of an interesting update that they came up with. So everything that we'll do today is going to be in the Python shell. It's going to be fairly simple, but we want to go through some of the basics, which will be your fundamentals into how you would do network automation. And what I've done is read through some of a book that I was using. So I'm using right now the automate the boring stuff with Python. In the previous video, I had showed like the first edition of this book, and then I realized there are some things that are different now. So I went ahead and got the print version of the third edition, and I also got the PDF. And so that's what I'm going to be using here. And when we talk about the data types are the most basic thing to start off with because it's what you're going to be dealing with data as you make queries and as you handle different like loops and functions. It all handles data. And when we talk about data and the data types, there are really three basic types we want to go over for this video. That's going to be an integer, which is a number, so something like -10, right? You can type that in, -10, that's an integer. We can type in 5, that is an integer, or any other whole number, 100. And so integer is really just a whole number. Now, once we add a decimal point and you add, say, -10.0, that becomes a floating point number. So that's your second data type. A floating point number is anything with a decimal. So I can take -10, an integer, and turn it into a floating point by just typing -10.0 or -10.01234. That's an integer. And then the third data type that we'll be dealing a lot with are strings. And strings are just text, right? So these will be text values that are called strings. And strings are usually going to be enclosed in quotes. And you can use a double quote and say something like corgi, that's a string. Or you can use a single quote and type corgi. right? So I've displayed here on my terminal using the Python shell. I just typed in Python 3. That's what I have installed on my Mac. And I've typed and showed you an integer value, a floating point, and also a string. Now the string could be empty as well. So a string is it's like it doesn't have to be a single word. It could be even a sentence, right? So you can say, I have a 1-year-old corgi at home. There's my string. So anything enclosed in the quotes, right? So I'll kind of clear this screen, and a string will start and end with the quote. You just want to be sure to include that. That's always important. The integer and the floating point, they don't have quotes around them. If you put a quote around an integer, say if you do this, that is now a string. It's no longer an integer. So if you add a quote to a number, quotes around a number, it becomes a string. Anything with a quote becomes a string. And even if you did 5.0, you take a floating point, put that into quotes, that's a string. And so just remember, you've got the 3 data types. There's the integer, a whole number, floating point, which includes a decimal, and then your string characters. Now, it is possible to add strings together. Like in Python, they call that concatenation. Always have a hard time saying that word. But what that would really mean is taking 2 strings and putting it together. What that would look like is I could use my name, and let's say I want to add my last name to it. So I'll use an operator, which is the addition here, and then I'll type in the other string. And so if you look at this statement right here, how would you think this would actually come together? Probably not the way you originally would think, just going through grade school and understanding how you put sentences together. It actually just combines them together. And so if I'm talking about my first name and last name, there needs to be a space in there. And so remember, I talked about having a string with nothing in it, an empty string. So you could do the concatenation, but you would include an empty string. So in there, I have a space, and then I'm just adding another string. So there's 3 strings being added together. And so now I get a single string with that space in there. So having being able to put strings together will also be useful as we move along in this journey for network automation, putting sentences together where you could say, have a phrase like, here's how many interfaces this router has. And then you would concatenate a variable there. And so we'll talk about variables. And when we talk about concatenation, while I'm on this topic, you cannot add a string and an integer. It's just not going to work. And so when you do that, you'll have an error. So if I try to say my name twice, right, you just want to say it twice. Roel. So we have this string here. We're going to concatenate an integer. Python does not allow that. And so there you go. It's saying traceback. Usually traceback just means there's an error somewhere, and it's pointing out to line 1. So if you had this in a script and there was this traceback error, it would tell you where in the line number of your script you have this problem, and it actually tells you here you can only concatenate string, not integer to string, right? But what's interesting to me with Python is you could multiply it. You can multiply a string. You just can't concatenate a string and an integer. So I can say Roel times 2, right? So this is the multiplication operator or expression here. And so Roel times 2. And that would actually print out my name twice, Roel. Kind of interesting. Not sure how that works out. I don't know how I would use this yet. in a future script, but we'll see. The other thing to note is concatenating an integer and a float. And so if we wanted to do 5 plus 5.0, that will turn it into a float, 10.0. And so how do I know what this all means? Like how do you know it's a what data type it is? Um, I will go into this later, but there is something called there's a built-in function called type. And so if I say I'll get into that. Let's talk about variables first because I do want to use the variables, and then we'll talk about determining the kind of data type. So variables will be used quite a bit, right? Variables, they have this, they're used widely, and you want to place values into a variable, and then you use that variable in your script. You call it out different times. So in what I've seen with scripting is you could create or make a get request. So if I'm going to query a cloud API and I want to determine how many access points there are at a site, I need to put that response that the API will give me into something so I could use it later on. And so I take that response and I put it into a variable. And so you name that variable whatever you want, and it just contains a value, right? So if we dig into variables, um, let's use an example. And so I'm taking all of these examples that I've written out from my blog. If you go to roeldionisio.com/blog, I have a category there called 0 to network automation, and I try to reinforce what I learned by writing it and then labbing it and then doing these videos. So we're going to use the example that I have on my blog where we're moving out of our room. So I'm moving out of this room here, and let's say I have 3 boxes. Those boxes, we need to write down what's in the box, right? You want to know what you're putting into the box, and so um, I'm gonna take collectibles. I'll put that into one box. I'll take all these toys. I'll put it into another box, and then I'll take clothes and put that into another box. So 3 separate boxes. What that would look like as a variable, the box is the variable. So this is the box. That is my variable, and I need to assign a value. And we do assignment with this equals sign right there. And then I will use a string. So if my collectibles, I'll say I have Pokemon cards. That I want to assign Pokemon cards to this variable called collectibles. And so now that's there. And then I have some other collectibles or toys. So I'm going to have toys. I'm going to define a variable called toys, and I will assign Legos to that. And so Legos is assigned to the variable toys. And now we have clothes, right? So now I have another variable, and I'm going to assign Padres shirt. And there you go. I have defined 3 different variables that each have 3 different values, which happen to be strings, right? You could assign a number to a variable. So you could say, number of boxes is a variable, and I could just define 3. And now there's an integer in in that variable. So I've defined a couple of variables. So you could hold an integer into a variable. You could hold a floating point into a variable. You could hold a lot of data into a variable. You're just going to use that variable later on. But we're going to keep it simple because I've been looking at some other scripts as examples. I don't want to get too ahead of myself here and overcomplicate things. But it's important to note that there are rules around how you define a variable. A variable cannot start off with a number, and I'll show you. So if I called this 3 boxes as my variable, Python will complain about it. So it actually shows me there with the caret that number 3, it's in red. It's an invalid decimal literal. I just can't have a number in front of a variable. It doesn't matter. So I can say 10 boxes equals 10. It's still going to complain. Can I have one box? No, can't do it. Right. So you cannot have a number in front in the beginning of your variable. A variable also cannot have spaces. So I can't say number of boxes equals 3. So now it's complaining. It's like, hey, which one here is a variable? There's 3 words. And so you cannot put spaces in your variable. So you would have to use something like underscores. You can have underscores in your variable, or you could say number of boxes. Something easy to read. I'm not a big fan of using underscores in variables. I think it's a little bit harder to type out, um, but I do want to make it readable. So I like starting off with a lowercase, and then if the variable is kind of long, you don't want to keep it too long, but I'll uppercase the first letter of the word, put it together as one, and it's easier to read, in my opinion. And you don't want too long of a variable. I think that kind of gets crazy as you're making scripts. Like you always want to call out this long variable. The other thing that's restricted in variables is you can't have a Python keyword. So a Python keyword could be something like print. Print is I think I haven't tried this out actually. So let's try. Um, so print equals boxes. So I'm creating a variable called print. I'm gonna assign boxes to it. I don't know if it'll allow me. Let's see. It does. I don't know what function it what Python keyword you can't assign to it. Okay. So I can't use if, because if is used in like loop statements, if statements, and so we'll get to that in a different video. And so you just as we work with Python, we'll just understand some Python keywords cannot be used as a as a variable. All right. So you only want to use letters, numbers, and an underscore character in your variable. Just cannot begin with a number. You cannot have spaces in your variable, and you cannot have a Python keyword in your variable. And so now we get into some of the basic functions that I've seen built into Python. And earlier I was talking about like variables and data types. So this is where it starts to come together. And the most basic function is to print something. And you want to print something to the screen, excuse me, or you want to print something to a file, you name it. Right. So the print function starts off with print. This is the syntax. And then it's got the, geez, why is the name not coming to me? This is the syntax. And so that's the print function, right? So I just hit enter and it's telling me an error because whatever I put in there, uh, it's not readable. There's nothing there to call. And so I wanted to print, say, the most common thing is hello world, right? As people start to learn programming. And in this case, I'm printing a string because remember, we're using a data type here. This print function is going to print a string because I've enclosed it in quotes called hello world. And when I hit enter, why didn't I like that? Is not callable. Okay, let's try to troubleshoot this. Print hello. What am I doing wrong here? String object is not callable. Whoa, what's going on? What did I do? I don't know what I did here. All right. Oh, you guys know what I did there? I don't know why I messed that up. Something something happened. Um Sorry, I'm just reading the comments. Uh Thank you guys for joining. I didn't even know anyone was here. But appreciate you guys taking the time. Let me fix the voice thing. I know it's kind of low. I think it's because I have echo cancellation on. Uh, Hopefully that's a lot better. I've already gone through quite a bit with the low volume, so apologize for that. Um, I had a problem doing a print function. I have no idea why it gave me an error. But what I did here is I'm using the print function, and in the parentheses here, I'm printing a string. And earlier I'd mentioned the data types. You can have a string, an integer, and a floating point. There's other data types, but just keeping it very basic for now. And I want to print this string, and so that's what it dropped out. I can even print an integer if I want, so I can just say print 9, and there's 9. And one of the built-in functions within Python is this type function. And so I was talking about how you'd know what a data type is, what type, what is it. And so if I use the variable, right, I'll just do variable 1, and let's assign that to my name. And then variable 2, we'll assign that to an integer. And then variable 3, we'll use a floating point. So I've defined 3 variables using the assignment operator here, the equals, and then a string within quotations, an integer, a whole number, and a floating point with a decimal. Now I need to know what data type is this? So what is stored in the variable 1 variable? So I can use type and then type in the variable, and it will tell me what the data type is. So it's telling me this is a class string, right? So if I print variable 1, it says Roel, and it's a string because it's been enclosed in a quotations. Then if I do a type on variable 2, it says it's an integer because it's a whole number. Same thing with variable 3. We'll use the type function, and it's a floating point. So that's how I know what kind of data type it is, and how I've used it and implemented it within within the script or within Python. And as you work with it, you might have errors like, hey, I can't print this because it's not this specific data type. And so usually that's what might happen. So let's see here. You guys have any questions so far? I know it's pretty basic. Hopefully some of you guys already know what it means and how it works. Okay, I'm just making sure that there's nothing else I need to address. I don't see the chat for LinkedIn, so I apologize. And I do see the chat for YouTube. So if you do find this useful, and at least I'm telling you things that make sense, let me know in the comments or just give me a thumbs up on the video. I would appreciate it. I'm just trying to make sure that I address everything that makes sense. All right. So one of the other basic functions that's available in Python is this input function. And this is used to get information from the user that is looking at the screen. And so usually that could, if you build a web front end, that's all of the data you're typing in, that's an input. And then you take that input and you put that into maybe a variable, right? So that, let's just say I want to type in a define a variable called username, but I want the user to punch in their username. I want them to type it out. So I will assign that for the variable, I will assign the input function to that variable. And so whatever the user types in, it will go into the variable username, right? And so here you can't really tell from this Python shell, but it is asking me for input. So I can just say my username is Roel. I'll type that in. There you go. It's assigned it to the username variable. That's how easy it was. And I want to now print the username. What is the username? So I'm using the print function, and I will print the variable and the contents of that variable. And it says it's Roel. Now, the other question is, what kind of data type is this? And I would probably guess a string. So we can do type username, and it's a class string. So that's using the input. You could also like let's say maybe the input is a number. It's an integer. What do you do then, right? Because let's just say age variable, and we'll do input, right? What is the age? And I'm 21 years old. Type that in. But if I did type age to determine the data type, it says it's a string. So this should be an integer, right? And not a floating point, because we're not going to say my age is 21.1, although we could probably do that, 21 and 1 month old. But we have an integer in this age variable, but maybe it needs to be converted into an integer because it's a string right now. So there is a function called int for integer, and we could say age 21. So then we can do type int age. Starting to get a little complicated here. And so it's telling me it's a type integer. And that's because I took the function integer and converted what was in that variable into an integer. Now this won't work for something that's actually a string. It's not an integer, right? So if I took the username variable and passed that into the int function, it's going to say, hey, I don't actually see an integer in there, a number, something that's with base 10. Roel isn't a base 10. It's invalid. And so just got to be careful with converting those. And so that's one way to grab input. And then again, I'm just trying to show you how other ways you can get input and then convert them to the right data type. The other thing is you might want to determine the length of a string, for example. We can say the length function, and that's defined as len, like that, right? So if I take username again, and this is just a variable I still have defined in my session here within the Python shell, and it's going to look at my name and determine the length of the name, right? What I inputted and what's now stored in the username variable. So the length of my name is 6, right? And again, we can print username, and that's my name, my first name, and it's 6 characters in length. Where I find the length function that makes sense to me just right now is maybe in the password. So if someone's password is, password 1234, and don't ever use this password. So this is a string that I'm assigning to the password variable, right? And let's say you want to enforce a password length. You could use the length function to say, hey, what is the length of this password? The variable, the password in the variable password. And if it is less than 16, then you could probably have some other function that defines them, that tells them, hey, your password is too short. And so that's the one thing that comes to my mind when I'm thinking about the length function and how it could be used. or maybe you were troubleshooting. Like, here's another thing that came to my mind. Maybe you're troubleshooting and you're wanting to see the bytes increment for an interface, and you would expect the length longer than 0. And then maybe that's something. But I'm just thinking off the top of my head. And Andy, thanks for joining me, Andy. I know you're on your Python journey too. I've been listening to your stuff, and so I think it'll be cool to see where we both land. Because I encourage you to go check out Andy and his journey to learning Python. So we're kind of on the same path, but both doing it separately. All right. So what's the other built-in function? So let's say, what was some of the other things I was doing? So the age variable. So again, I'll print the age variable. It's 21. Or I can say, what type is that actually? It's a string. So I will reassign this with an integer. So as you go through Python, just because you defined a variable up at the top, you can redefine it again at the bottom. So now if I print age, maybe I can just do a different number. Now you see that the number is different. And so then if I do type age, it actually classifies it as an integer because I didn't put it in quotes. And usually when you do an input, it'll make it a string when you take that when Python takes input from the user. And so now we have this class integer for this age variable. And let's just say we want to turn it into a string. There is a built-in function called str or string. You do that. And I want to take that age variable, right? And it's an integer because I know it because I did the type age and it said integer, but I want to turn it into a string now. So if I do string age and then actually do string or type string age, it's going to tell me now it's a string. And you can see it enclosed it in quotes. So that's if you need to turn something into a string. There's going to be different scenarios where you might do something like this. For example, if we're, again, combining strings together. Or maybe you don't want to combine. Remember when I said you couldn't combine a string with an integer? Well, you could do that here if you said print, or let's see, username plus age, right? It should complain. But if I did username plus string age, there you go. Combined it because I turned it into a string. So I can just say username, make it more readable, plus string age. So now I've combined those two, made it a little bit readable by adding a space there. And again, using the type function to determine the data type. It's probably something I'll do often as I work with scripts to make sure I'm modifying something of the right data type as I try to include it into something else. Now, the other built-in functions that we have, earlier I mentioned the integer and the float functions. So I could say, let's define a variable called NewPy, and I will then use, actually, let me do this. If I define a variable called pi and it's 3.14 and I check the data type, it should define it as a float. But if I wanted to make it an integer, I could say NewPy equals integer pi and then do type NewPy. Now it's an integer, even though we have a decimal point in there. But I had used the built-in function int to turn it into an integer. You can do the same thing with the float function. So what you would do is type in float NumPy, and it turned it back into a floating point. You can do type float NumPy to see and confirm, and it is a float. And so there's a lot of different ways to modify data, modify variables, and change things around. You just want to keep track of them. I think I can see this getting out of hand pretty quickly as I've seen different scripts. But I think that's a lot of the basics that I wanted to go through at this time. Again, if we recap what I had talked about. So the very first thing is looking at the data types. And I only mentioned the integer data type, the floating point data type, and the string floating type. Those are the floating types that I'll probably be working with in the next few videos, and keeping it pretty simple. And then as we ramp up, we'll probably see more data types. Then we looked into the concatenation, combining different strings together, and understanding you can't combine a string with an integer, but you can convert the integer into a string and then combine it with another string. Yeah, so kind of fancy there. And then the interesting part about the concatenation is being able to multiply a string. And so I don't know when I would use that. And then we talked about variables and what the restrictions are for naming your variables and what you could assign to a variable. And variables, we're going to deal with a lot, right? We're going to store a lot of data into a variable. We're going to iterate on variables and see what's inside of them, and then make new variables based on that. We'll use variables within loops, you name it. So I'm already a few chapters ahead of this video, and we'll see how this progresses. But you could create a lot of different variables. You could reassign them as you use them within a script. And so variables are going to be used quite a bit. Just remember, it cannot start with a number, and you cannot have spaces. And also you cannot have a Python keyword. So you can only use letters, numbers, and an underscore, and then just stick to a standard naming convention for your variables. So that'll make your life easier down the road. And then we talked about some basic functions. The print and the input are probably going to be used quite a bit for us, especially when we want to get information from the user and then assign that to a variable and then print certain things out depending on what we want to do with the script. And we will be printing out a lot of things. We'll use a print statement. We'll print things to terminal. We'll print things to a file or something on screen, maybe a web front end. We don't know yet. I don't know where I'm going to go with it, but I know for the most part, I will be printing things to the Python shell or just to terminal. And then we talked about the input function, where we just grab input from the user. We may want to ask them something like maybe, hey, what's the interface you want to look at? And then we could iterate on interfaces. Then we talked about the length function, determining the length of a string as an example, using the string function to convert something into a string. So you can convert an integer or floating point into a string data type. And then the opposite with the integer and the float functions. You could turn a floating point number into an integer. You can turn an integer into a floating point. I don't know where we would use those just yet, but as I was going through the book, Automate the Boring Stuff with Python, that was kind of what they were describing so far. I will say the Automate the Boring Stuff book is so far working out for me. I have been pretty happy with it in terms of understanding, and there's also a workbook that you can get with it. And so I have the workbook. I also have the PDF versions of these books because I will be using them when I get on a plane. But that's where I'm at. And so we've reached the end of this live stream. So I want to thank the ones who joined joining me here. Hopefully you're also doing it as I'm working with Python and you're learning something, or maybe it's a good refresher for you. Andy, thanks for joining me, taking the time out of your day to to come check in. Thank you for joining from Nepal. Really appreciate it. Uh, but yeah, let me know what you guys think. Is this useful? Is this something you want to continue seeing? Just give me a thumbs up reaction or put in the comments what you want to see. Uh, it is very basic right now, obviously, because it's episode 1 of the zero to network automation journey that I'm on. But I will be documenting everything on my blog. If you go to roeldionisio.com/blog, there is a category there for zero to network automation. So it's not just video based. I will write it out. I think for me, writing it out helps me learn it much better, much quicker. And then doing it like this in video for a lab helps reinforce that. So I'm doing like the triple the amount of work to try to learn this, right? You do the reading, then you do the explaining to somebody with video, and even writing down from my notes what am I trying to do. So again, appreciate you guys all joining in. I hope to hear some feedback. I'm really interested to know how this works out for you, if you think it's useful, and what else you might want to see. But personally, it is my journey to learning more Python. I want to do this within 12 months, kind of be aggressive with it, and do some sort of network automation, maybe on the 12th or 13th month, hopefully. And so I will be getting on a plane in a few hours. I'm going to, of course, be learning more Python while I sit there on the plane. And maybe I'll come back next Saturday for a live stream, but I do get back from traveling that day before, and so it might be challenging for me. I'll be all out of sorts with the time zones and when I'll be going to a conference. But thank you guys for joining. Appreciate it. I'll see you guys around. I'll hang out for a bit if you have any questions, but thank you so much.